All right, guys. So this is what you're going to need to complete this project. Of course, the links for these parts will be down in the description. So of course, we have our inner tie rod here, our tie rod end, and our tie rod boot. Now, you may not need these depending on the condition of the ones already on the car, but that's good to have. And of course, if you don't need them, then you can go ahead and return them. And they do come with zip ties. All right, step one, get the car up on jack stands. You want the wheels to be suspended. All right, so next we're gonna go ahead and remove the bolt for the tie rod end. Now this looks like an aftermarket tie rod end, because typically you have like a castle nut that has a cotter pin in here. On this one, it is a 15 millimeter. But when you go to break the jam nut loose on the tie rod end, you wanna do it while the nut is still on. So in this case, on the Moog one, I'm gonna go ahead and use this 22 millimeter wrench, and you just put it on the jam nut and go ahead and break this free. Once you get it loose, you can go ahead and take everything else apart and allow you to spin that tie rod in freely. So what you're going to notice when you take the nut off is that it's not going to fall free. So what you're going to have to do is get a hammer and smack the side of the knuckle here, and that'll actually jar this free. You can also get a ball joint separator and put it under here to separate this. Now most of the time those do destroy the bushing. So if you're looking to reuse the part for whatever reason, you don't want to use that. You can also just put the nut back on here about halfway and smack on the top of that and it'll get it free. But it normally comes out with a few taps. So before we get to disassembly, we're gonna go ahead and look at the inner tie rod. And this is why we're replacing. The tie rod should be able to support itself. I'm willing to bet this is the original tie rod that came on the car, and this car does have like 180,000 miles on it. So it's definitely time for a replacement. The tie rod in is moving separately from this lock nut here. What I actually ended up having to do is put another wrench on the tie rod in itself, and that was a 21 millimeter. You probably should get a professional alignment after you get this done. Now we are going to try to match these tie rod ends as best as possible, but it's always a good idea to plan for that. Like I said, before we take this off, you can go ahead and put a piece of tape on the back here, on the back of the nut, just to mark the spot, or you can count the rotation. So we're going to keep in mind that the tie rod, the threaded part is going to face up, and we're just going to turn it. All right, so I got the tie rod end off. I went ahead and counted it into being 19 rotations, which was different from the other side, just by the way. And I also put a little rubber band on the end just to mark the place where the nut was, and I'll show you guys why later. So next, we need to go ahead and remove the boot itself. So it's got a pretty standard clip on the front. So for that, you just need a pair of pliers. And you will have to get under the car to get the clip that's on the back holding the boot. So I couldn't reach it from the top, so I did have to get under the car. But if you guys look right there, that clip right there has a little loop in it. So what you have to do is get a screwdriver. You might be able to grab it with a pair of pliers and twist it, and it'll pop right off, and then we'll be able to pull the boot out. All right, so here's the boot off. And you can see this is one still in pretty good shape. There aren't any cracks anywhere in it. So I'm gonna go ahead and reuse this one and send the Moog one I bought back. And here's the little clip. Once you can get it to move, it comes off pretty easily. So we're gonna go ahead and throw this away. Now in the Moog kit, they do provide plastic zip ties to secure the boot. So you can use zip ties to reattach this, but I'm not a fan of those. They're kind of small, and I feel like that's not a permanent solution. So I'm gonna show you guys what I'm gonna use. All right, so this is really the only specialty tool you'll need during this whole project. So this is a inner tie rod removal set. This one, of course, came from Harbor Freight. It's a Pittsburgh brand. Harbor Freight actually had two different versions, this one and a Maddox. You can also rent these from like AutoZone or Advanced, something like that. So now you're gonna need that tool just because in most cases you can't get to the back of it where it accepts to remove it, which is back here, because there's normally suspension parts in the way. This basically slides over the entire tie rod end, and then one of these fittings, or one of these adapters, goes around the back side of it. All right, so here's the adapter that fits on my tie rod. This is the 1 5/16. So what we're gonna do is just slot this over the very back. You guys can see that, just slide it over the back of the tie rod. And then we're gonna slot this guy over. So if you look on the sides, it has a spot that accepts like the feet on the adapter. And you can actually move this little metal ring that'll lock it in. All right, so now I've got the adapter and the extension secured. Now if you notice on the end of it, it has a spot for a 1/2 inch impact or ratchet. And at this point, it's just righty tighty, lefty loosey. All right, so here we can see the old one, and it is completely shot. There's no rigidity in it, a lot of play. Here's the new replacement. As you can see, it has no problem supporting its own weight. It's actually pretty stiff, and we're gonna go ahead and get this put on. So at this point, what you wanna do is just try your best to line them up, and then I'm gonna match my two marks. So if you use tape or like my rubber band, I'm gonna move it over onto this one, so I know an approximate stopping point for my tie rod end, or the nut on the tie rod end. All right, so I got my rubber band in place. I did count the turns as well, so between both of those, I should get it pretty close to where it was, and I know it was aligned before. So now we're about ready to install. What I'm going to do is get some blue Loctite, put on this thread here, and you're just going to thread it back into your steering column, into that hole. What I forgot to mention, it does include this washer. It has these areas that are raised. You want to make sure they are facing the steering column, so they face in, and they'll actually lock into cutouts on the steering column. So you can see that where the cutouts are, you're going to line those raised parts with those cutouts. Like now, the Moog inner tie rod actually uses a different fitting, so we're going to use this 1 3/16 adapter. Alright, so these are what I'm going to use. These are actually metal zip ties, so they function pretty much the same as your plastic ones. They're just going to be a lot more durable. So I'm going to go ahead and get these loosely fitted onto my boot, and we're going to slide this guy over. Alright, so I got it ready. I'm going to clip these after I get them on, because you do need some excess, so you can use to tighten them down with a little tool that I have. But other than this, you can just take this boot and slide it back onto our tie rod. Alright guys, so we're under the car looking at the back side of the tie rod. Of course, this is what we're looking for right here, is that this washer that we put on is flat up against here. And you can see all we have to do now is just slide this boot all the way down. Alright, so first we're going to go ahead and put our jam nut back on. And we're going to tighten this down to about where your tape, or in my case, my rubber band is. Alright, so now all we need to do is tighten our tie rod end down and just make sure we count it correctly. Alright, so it's back on. Our castle nut has been tightened. Last step is you want to go ahead and put your cotter pin in. So we'll get that cotter pin in there and then go ahead and bend the ends of it. And now we're done.